Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Can Catholics believe in evolution? Is it possible to hold fast to the truths of sacred scripture and the Catholic faith, while at the same time believing in the modern idea of evolutionary theory? Personally, I don't think so. Now, I want to make it clear what I'm not doing here. I'm not anathematizing somebody else. I don't have the power to do that, and I'm not meaning to take pot shots at various individuals, because they may have different ideas about this. But what I am saying is that I do believe that the history of dogma in the church is radically opposed to the history or the modern history of evolutionary theory. And we're going to look into why that's the case. There's a load of church teaching against what would necessarily be held by an evolutionist. We're going to dive into that and consider some of the consequences of that. Before I continue, I want to say thank you to the Kolbe Center for putting together the information that I'm going to read or go through. The Kolbe Center is the best, if not the only, Catholic apostolate concerned with the traditional Catholic teaching on origins. And by traditional Catholic, I mean the teaching that the church has always had on the reality of the beginning of time, the beginning of the earth, the human race, the age of the earth, and so on and so forth. And it's a go-to place. So go to www.kolbecenter.org. That's kolbecenter.org. I'm not officially affiliated with them in any way. I did have an article published there like 4.5 years ago. But I do heartily support them, and I hope God continues to bless their work, because it's some of the best stuff out there. Okay, so what does the Catholic Church teach on evolutionary theory? Well, the first thing that we have to do is we have to sort of define our terms here. What do we mean first and foremost by church teaching? That's an interesting question. Church teaching does not just mean the various opinions of theologians, popes, and even great saints throughout church history. Of course, we look to those things to understand church teaching. But at the same time, we know that we can find opinions and even popes and saints and so forth that aren't necessarily dogmatic insofar as they're binding on Catholics. So church teaching, in the sense that we're using it here, is things that we have to believe in order to be Orthodox Catholics. And ultimately, we have to be Orthodox Catholics in order to be saved, at least as far as we know the dogma of the church. If we unknowingly reject something, this is not our fault, and God will judge us the way that he will. But, it can't be said that so-and-so was officially a heretic and rejected this thing or that thing. These things can happen just by not understanding things. I mean, we look at some of the great saints in church history, and some of them held to opinions which later were not really held anymore. And some of them, you might even say it's close to an error, but it wasn't defined at the time. It was a matter of debate, and they sort of just had a different opinion. So when it comes to church teaching on evolution, or church teaching on origins, we're looking at, okay, what are some dogmatic statements of things that have to be believed as per the church's perennial magisterium, and is that still the case today? And we're going to find that there is a huge wealth of teaching that is required of us, or it's required of us to believe. It's not just something we can throw away. That doesn't mean every single opinion of every Catholic theologian, saint, or pope on origins from a given time in history would necessarily be how we have to interpret that teaching, but it does mean we have to take these things seriously. On the other hand, we have to define our terms. What is evolution? There are two ways of looking at evolution, generally speaking. On the one hand, you have microevolution, which we might also call adaptation. This is totally believable. This is totally acceptable for Catholics. This is, like the idea of, a certain animal, goes to a certain region or climate and adapts, and it might change its color a little bit, or a bird's beak changes in length or something like that. I mean, these things happen all the time. This happens to human beings. In fact, if you grow up in a warmer climate versus a colder climate, you'll actually have a different thickness to your blood. This is a guy I met at our men's conference told me a story of how he was from Florida growing up and moved to Canada for university. Ended up staying here, and he went to donate blood. It was, part of the initiation for that first week of university. And the blood was doing these funny things when it came out, and he thought something was wrong. And the nurse said, "Oh, you must be from somewhere warm." And anyway, that was just a difference. People who move to northern climates, they get thicker ends, the tips of their fingers, even if they're already grown. At a certain age, it's hard to keep adapting. But if you're in your 20s, 30s, or 40s, you actually move to a colder climate, and you can actually get thicker ends of your fingers, and they get actually fatter. The blood vessels, produce more, bring more blood there. They actually grow in size, and this is so that way you can still do things in the cold with warmer fingers. These are just little examples of adaptations, and more significant ones take place. But nonetheless, what these are changes within an infrastructure, within a framework, within a structure that just sort of makes something that already happens act a little bit differently to adapt to a certain surrounding. This is microevolution. This is seen with dogs. This is seen with all types of animals. This is seen with crops. Nothing wrong with this whatsoever. But macroevolution is really what we're talking about when it comes to evolutionary theory. This is the idea that, one form of a thing turns into another form of a thing, or one species of a thing turns into another species of a thing. So, if we look at the canine species, all canines can at least in some way interbreed. I mean, it might not be possible for certain dogs to impregnate other dogs because of some physiological differences there. But nonetheless, you can breed dogs with wolves. Why? Because they're all canines. In a similar way, even though it's rare and doesn't always work out very well, you can actually breed various types of equines. So zebras and donkeys. There's something called a Z-donk, if you can imagine that. It's actually a zebra and a donkey. They're all part of the equine. It doesn't happen very often. They're usually infertile. It's not good. But the point is that they can procreate with one another, where you can't procreate, with a horse and a deer, because they're just a different species. Okay, so there's a certain line that's crossed. And the idea behind macroevolutionary theory is that you go from one form of a thing or one species to something completely different that's separate, but that would come from it. So the classic idea of sort of ape-like pre-human hominid creatures evolve into human beings. That's so absurd, in my opinion, in so many ways. But nonetheless, we're not going to consider the depths of that here. We're just going to look at church teaching. So what does the church teach on origins, and how does that apply to evolutionary theory? Well, let's take a look. As I said, this document is from the Kolbe Center, and thanks to them for this. So point number one, what does the Catholic Church teach about origins? This is the first one. It says, God created everything in its whole substance from nothing, or ex nihilo, in the beginning. This is from Lateran IV and the First Vatican Council. So again, is this church teaching? Well, we're looking at some of the teachings from ecumenical councils. Now, in fairness, I want to be as fair as possible. There are certain things in councils that are not infallible. And this is why I don't have a problem saying Vatican II is not infallible, because even if you look into the great works of Cajetan and Bellarmine and that era of scholars talking about the Council of Trent, they acknowledge that things that are defined in councils with anathemas or definitions are infallible in the narrow sense that they're interpreted. But the explanations for various dogmas aren't necessarily infallible, because that's just not the way that it works. That's another conversation for another day. But when we do look to this teaching specifically, I know for a fact that the example here from the First Vatican Council is attached to an anathema. So it says God created everything in its whole substance from nothing in the beginning. Excuse me. Now, what does this mean? What are the implications of this? Well, the implications are, that doesn't mean God created all things that exist now. He's talking about the substance of things. So, that which constitutes what a thing is. So a human being is part of that human thing. It's not part of that other thing. These are philosophical terms, and we don't need to go into the depths here, but we're just sort of trying to say it as easy as possible. So this means that at the beginning of time, all that was there for the created order was already created, and everything was in its own substance. I don't know how you square away this idea that you could have something like macroevolutionary theory. I just don't see it. Point number 2, Genesis does not contain purified myths. This is true. This is from the Pontifical Biblical Commission. The Pontifical Biblical Commission is not it's not the way it is today. In fact, while the Pontifical Biblical Commission was a powerhouse under Pope Pius X, it was actually a mortal sin. It was seen as a mortal sin to dispute or to depart from the teachings of the Pontifical Biblical Commission, because it was an extension of the papal magisterial authority. Today, there is a Pontifical Biblical Commission. It does not operate in the same way. It's sort of a bait and switch, something with the same name, but has been downgraded completely. So anything that comes from the PBC today, you could basically just disregard, the same way you might disregard things from the Pontifical Academy for Sciences or something like that. What else does it say? Well, Genesis contains real history. It gives an account of things that really happened. This was held by Pius XII. These are shorthand here, but you can find this also in the Pontifical Biblical Commission. Continuing. Adam and Eve were real human beings, the first parents of all mankind. This is a dogma par excellence. You cannot deny this dogma. It's not just Pius XII, but this is clear in church history. I personally don't see how you arrive at this idea that there are two parents for the whole human race with evolutionary theory. And I'll explain just briefly why I think that is. Excuse me. Evolution is not like if you ever played that game Pokemon. You know, I'm 35 and it was a thing when I was like 12 years old. How time flies. In that game, you know, you'd reach a certain level and then the thing would just evolve into like a new level. That's not the way evolution works. If we actually look at the sort of materialistic evolutionary ways that are accepted by a lot of scientists today, not all of them, but some of them, basically through a series of trial and error against all mathematical odds possible, you get to the point where there's some sort of aberration or mutation or change in one of the offspring of some species, and then that thing is a new species. Essentially, that's what happens. Well, I guess you could say it's possible that the same sort of genetic change happened with another couple from the same species that produced something basically identical to the other one that was also an aberration, and then they could get together and make the human race. I'm trying to follow it through here, but it really is monstrous. And we do have to take into account the character of God. I mean, it really is a disgusting way to create. It's absolutely, it's a horrendous and vile way of creating the human race. And I think it should be rejected. But I don't know how otherwise you would get to this idea of Adam and Eve. I mean, you have to believe it as a Catholic. I don't know how it's reconcilable with evolutionary theory. Continuing. Polygenism, many first parents, contradict Scripture and is condemned. This is true. You can see this condemned by Pius XII. Even in the Catechism, the new one says it. The beginning of the world included the creation of all things, the creation of Adam and Eve and the fall. This is in Mark. This is Pope Innocent III. This is Blessed Pope Pius IX and Ineffabilis Deus. It's one of his encyclicals. The body of Eve was specially created from a portion of Adam's body. Leo XIII taught this. She could not have been created via evolution. Various senses are employed in the Bible, but the literal obvious sense must be believed unless reason dictates or necessity requires. This is super important. This is seen in Aquinas. This is seen in lots of places, but this is seen by Leo XIII in Providentissimus Deus. This is important. A lot of the time, people who are Catholics who try to advocate for some sort of theistic, sort of God-guided evolutionary theory, they'll point to this and they'll say, I agree with that, but because it's proven that evolution is true, therefore my reason tells me I have to interpret it this way. But that's not true. It is not proven that evolution is true. If you look into the writings of various evolutionary thinkers, in their own works, they contradict themselves. They are contradicted by others in the same fields. People believe that evolution is this hard and fast scientific doctrine. The idea that evolution took place is believed by the vast majority of scientists, but the mechanisms, the explanations, anyone's game. As I said, I'm 35 years old. Even the way that evolution took place has changed 2 or 3 times according to the mainstream since then. People throw around these terms like Big Bang and evolution, and they think that there's just this, canon law or book of scientific scriptures that all of these scientists appeal to. It's not the case at all. Again, there's a consensus amongst many scientists that evolution is true, but there is no consensus in any sort of moral majority sense about how it took place, the age of things. I mean, when you look at the estimations of the various ages of species and stuff, it's, within a few 100,000 years window. 200,000 years. That's not even an educated guess. My point here is that your reason does not require you to try to interpret Scripture and church teaching with evolutionary theory, because it's not an established fact. It's not like 2 + 2 is 4, or, the way that penicillin works against, bacteria. None of these, nothing in evolution is that. Evolution is very much an activity of historical speculation. It's complete inference from things never seen, and then applying processes that we see today to explain how those things came to be as a way of explaining it. But it's not observable. It cannot be observable. It cannot fall under the lens of pure scientific research, because you can never observe the effects of something over 100,000 or a million years, because you obviously can't do an experiment that long. All you can do is look at the way things happen in the present day and apply those ages and sort of multiply them and try to recreate the various environments that you think they would happen within, and then say, well, this is proof that it could work. But that is still speculation. And again, as I said, there is a massive amount of dispute within the communities of scientists that believe in evolutionary theory. Adam and Eve were created upon an earthly paradise and would not have known death if they had remained obedient. This is Pius XII. After disobedience of God, Adam and Eve were banished from the Garden of Eden, but the second person of the Trinity would subsequently pay ransom for fallen man. This is the Nicene Creed. Original sin is a flawed condition inherited from Adam and Eve. This is Council of Trent. The universe suffers in travail ever since the sin of disobedience by Adam and Eve. Romans 8 and Vatican I. Why is this important? The reason why this is important, inherent in this belief of evolution, from a basic philosophical perspective, is this idea, excuse me, this idea that what you're going from something like chaos to order. What do I mean by that? Let's just hash this out for a second here. In order to believe in evolutionary theory, you have to believe that there's a primitive or primordial existence, setting, environment, whatever you want to call it. And from there, you have what are less complex elements, the various chemicals, the ingredients, what have you. And from there, you go to you move up a trajectory to a state of more specificity, fine-tuning, and complexity. What does this mean? So imagine, if you will, let's go back to the creation of the world. I don't even know how you do that with evolution, because I don't even know. Anyway, I guess Big Bang, but Big Bang is a whole other thing. Let's just go back to this idea. Let's just say there's a primordial Earth, and we're somehow at this place where there is organic matter. Basically, I mean, you get to somehow, if you disregard church teaching that God literally created all things in their own substance, you have to believe that somehow, out of a primordial ooze, I guess, that you could have the evolution of some sort of living organism that comes from something that's basically non-living, which is impossible, I think. It's what's the word I'm looking for here? Something has to have a sufficient cause in it for something else. So you can't give what you don't have. Anyway, that's a basic principle of philosophy. I can't birth children, no matter what the woke people say, but me and my wife can't have children with wings because we don't have wings. We can't give wings. Something that doesn't have sight can't have something with sight. Anyway. But you'd have to believe something like that. You'd have to believe that there would be an actual improvement, because we know that if we look to the character of God, God is order. I mean, it's one of the aspects of God. God is precise. God is not chaotic. This idea of a chaotic God is a Gnostic idea. You know, there's a dualist idea where there's a God of good and violence and they sort of fight, or God of good and evil. But we believe God is perfectly ordered. We believe God is perfectly precise. And I guess someone might say, well, they believe in some sort of God-guided evolutionary theory. And I would say, okay, I would say that's possible, except if we look back to this doctrine here, the universe suffers in travail ever since the disobedience of Adam and Eve. What does this mean? Well, it means that the universe suffers the effects of sin, meaning that there's a disorder that's contracted, just like we see in Scripture. You know, when Adam and Eve have discord in their marriage. I don't know how we go from this primordial reality to what we have now without saying that in some way things have gone from the lower to the higher, which is, objectively speaking, in the hierarchy of creation, an improvement. Yet we see that Scripture and tradition and church teaching tells us that the opposite is true. I don't get it. Another one here. We must believe any interpretation of Scripture that the fathers taught unanimously on a matter of faith and morals. Excuse me. It is not the case that you will find in the church fathers unanimously, against evolution, because that wasn't really a thing. And it was philosophically in some ways. They were dealing with it, but it wasn't the way we have it today. But it is the case when you look into church fathers that you will find basically consensus about the newness of the world. So maybe they disagree on thousands of years here and there, but it's not a million years old or a billion. It's, 10,000 years have passed or something like that is sort of the extent of it. And there is a consensus that Adam and Eve are created, that there's a consensus with all of these teachings, even if it's not specifically evolution that's addressed. That's something you have to contend with as well. Here's another one. The work of creation was finished by the close of day 6, and nothing completely new has been created, except for each human rational soul at conception. That's Vatican I. St. Peter and Christ himself in the New Testament confirmed the global flood of Noah. It covered all the high mountains and destroyed all land-dwelling creatures except 8 human beings and all kinds of non-human creatures aboard the ark. That's an Unum Sanctam from 1302. Also, the historical existence of Noah's Ark is regarded as most important typology as central to the redemption. This is another one that I find super fascinating here. Here's where it talks about, because often people will point to Pope Pius XII and say, Pope Pius XII, and actually, you know what? We'll bring that document up here in a second, but I'll continue my thought first. Pope Pius XII taught that evolution is not to be taught as fact. So, since Pius XII, we don't actually really have any teaching on evolution from popes. As much as people like to think we do, we have some quotations. There's one from John Paul II, although it's I think there's two, maybe I'm mistaken. One of them, I don't think he actually ever said. It was written for him and he never actually gave the address. Pope Francis has said things like evolution is more than a theory, etc., which is true. Evolution is more than a theory. It's a religion for people. But the last weighty, authoritative teaching from the Pope in the encyclical Humani Generis, which is, if you don't know what Humani Generis is, if you don't know what it is a landmark encyclical. It is like Pope Pius XII's syllabus of errors, going through all of the errors of our day and just combating them. So I'm going to bring that up here in a second, because often people point to Humani Generis. We'll stop sharing this document for a second here. They'll point to Humani Generis, and they'll say, well, this is a pope, a traditional pope, Pius XII, saying you can believe in evolution. But is that actually what it says? So the classic paragraph everyone goes to, I'll just scroll down to it here. I've read this 100 times. Is paragraph 36. And, in fairness to places like Catholic Answers, I like Catholic Answers a lot. I think that they do a great disservice to the church with their discussions in evolution, though I have to say that. It's too bad. I don't know why they're so... they even did a series of shows called like Evangelizing Through Evolution. maybe the idea was find out what evolutionists believe about creation and stuff, but I thought that was very irresponsible. I don't know why they do that. There's no reason to. It's not church teaching. I don't know. It's not church teaching. Evolution is just not church teaching. But in any way, when you go to a lot of these places like Catholic Answers, they'll say, well, Pope Pius XII said we could believe evolutionary theory. What are they referring to? Well, let's bring this up. And this is paragraph 36, so after a lot of paragraphs, it says, for these reasons, the teaching authority of the church does not forbid that, in conformity with the present state of human sciences and sacred theology, research and discussions on the part of men experienced in both fields take place with regard to the doctrine of evolution, in as far as it inquires into the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existence and living matter. For the Catholic faith obliges us to hold that souls are immediately created by God. Okay, let's just stop there for half a second here. So all that's given as a permission is to have conversations, research by men experienced in both fields. I don't know if that means men who have experience in both fields or a man from one field and another. I think it would only make sense to be people who have experience in both fields, because if they don't know each other's doctrines, I don't know how they could really communicate. But anyway, and the lengths you're allowed to go to are inquire into the origin of the human bodies coming from pre-existent and living matter. That is not evolution at all. Pre-existent and living matter, meaning, let's look at Genesis. What does Genesis say? God created Adam out of the dust, the slime, the mud, whatever. So, what is that matter? Is it living matter? Is it inorganic matter? We can research that. It does not say pre-existing forms, pre-existing substances, pre-existing, I guess, essences. I don't know, I'm getting into my philosophical depth here. But it says looking into the pre-existing matter. There's nothing unscriptural about that. Of course, God, the imagery is he uses, he creates Adam out of the stuff of the earth. Okay, what is that stuff? We can look into it. But this idea that this is a permission to look into evolutionary theory, that is not what that is at all. And I don't know why people are so dishonest in using it. And it really is a shame. And he continues, and this is a whole indictment against the idea that we could look into evolution. He says, however, this must be done in such a way that reasons for both opinions, that is, those favorable and those unfavorable to evolution. I would add here, I don't know if this was Pius XII's intent, or if it's, maybe the words are used differently now. It probably would have been helpful if the word microevolution was used, or something like adaptation or macroevolution, because evolution, again, is too broad, but nonetheless, that's what's written. Be weighed and judged with the necessary seriousness, moderation, and measure, and provided that all are prepared to submit to the judgment of the church, to whom Christ has given the mission of interpreting authentically the sacred scriptures and defending the dogmas of the faith. So let's just say here, basically, how should I put this? Someone who believes in evolutionary theory as a Catholic is in no position, according to this, to teach their beliefs as if they are reconcilable with Catholic doctrine in a way that is actually Catholic teaching. What I mean by that is, what he's saying here is, people can look into this very narrow window of this idea of how creation takes place, pre-existing matter, etc. Does this have something to do with evolution? Again, in a very narrow window of expertise. Nothing like the Darwinian evolution craze that we have of our day. Nothing like that at all. And even from that, he says, weighing positions and the opinions of the experts on all the sides of the question, then there can be a judgment of the church on these things. There has been no judgment on the church. So what we have is centuries, a mountain of theological opinion, research, teaching, dogma that we went through that is completely contrary to the dogmas of evolution. But instead, what we have today is we have big Catholic organizations teaching theistic evolution in universities and high schools. This is completely against the most authoritative, most recent authoritative statement we have in church teaching on evolution. I don't know why this is. I've talked to many sort of conservative Catholics about this before, and it's like a complete blind spot. It's a complete and utter blind spot. And I don't know what it is. They don't want to have anything to do with it. At most, if I'm being as open-minded as possible, maybe you could argue something like within very narrow places of instruction, at a university with very learned people, a very traditionally Catholic-minded theological place, you could have like a debate on the topic and you could present for and against, and that would be fine. Maybe you could do that if we're trying to be strict here with the teaching of the church. But this idea that you could teach that the church teaches evolutionary theory is acceptable, this is not found in Catholic doctrine. It's just simply non-existent. It's a fiction. It doesn't exist. In addition, what else does it say? It says, some, however, rashly transgress the liberty of discussion. That's what I'm talking about right now. When they act as if the origin of the human body from pre-existing and living matter were already completely certain and proved by the facts which have been discovered up to now, and by reasoning on those facts as if there were nothing in the sources of divine revelation which demands the greatest moderation and caution in this question. It's exactly what I'm saying. He said it better than I could. He's the Pope. Evolutionary theory is not something that is supported by Catholic dogma. So if we were to believe in evolutionary theory, we'd have to believe these things. In the beginning, there was neither heaven nor earth, just concentrated primeval matter. This matter expanded and exploded. This explosion produced gas, mainly helium and hydrogen, which expanded over billions of years. Clumps of the gas contracted and formed the stars. One of these stars was our sun. There's actually a massive contradiction here for evolutionists because the mainstream dogma on how we even have these elements is through star fusion, but somehow they would precede the existence of the stars. You can't give what you don't have. I mean, this is completely absurd to even think that it could take place. At that point, this is the point when usually a theistic evolutionist would jump in and say, well, God did it. And it's like, we have God's revelation. It doesn't sound like anything like what you're talking about here. Why would you not try to find a way to make God's revelation fit the truth rather than trying to make, things opposite? It doesn't make any sense here. Part of the sun detached itself and became planet Earth. That's interesting. Radiometric dating strongly indicates that the Earth is more than 4 billion years old. Given enough time, random interactions of matter will produce spontaneous increases in specific complexity and randomly formed units of matter. When the planet cooled, chemicals reacted together to form amino acids. Primitive living cells resulted from combinations of the amino acids. A process of evolution led to the primitive cells developing into complex cells. Over millions of years, the cells transformed into higher organisms. Gradually, the organisms divided themselves into flora and fauna. All the known species of plants and trees evolved over immense periods of time, perhaps from some primitive form of algae. I want to talk about that just quickly here. So what do you look, when we look to the Garden of Eden, we believe that God creates man out of the earth, the stuff. So one of the words used is like slime, mud. It's amazing when you really look into these teachings of evolution. It really is just a parallel. It's been called the devil's gospel. It is, it's an anti-creation story. It still uses some of the same elements, but has to take God out of the equation. It's fascinating. All the known species of plants and trees evolved over immense periods of time, perhaps from some primitive form of algae. Similarly, man evolved from simple marine life, transformed over eons of time from some form of bacteria into all the aquatic land and air species that have ever existed. But here's the thing, I was talking about there are problems within evolutionary theory itself, and we'll see those now. So even within its own realm of science, there are things that contradict the things that are taught by other aspects of this same school of thought. Molecules to man evolutionary theory violates the second law of thermodynamics by positing spontaneous increases in order through random interactions of matter. Matter from explosions does not condense to form objects like galaxies. Chemicals do not react together randomly to form amino acids through natural processes. Again, nothing like that has ever been observed. And every time there's an attempt to observe something like that through experimentation, those who are doing that, those who are trying to put together experiments to prove that something random could happen in the past, have already lost the plot. Because what they're doing is they're doing something with their own intelligence in an ordered fashion to then try to prove how something happened randomly. This is impossible. I'll give you an analogy. When I was a teacher, I had this one student who was an atheist who kept trying to disprove the existence of God. And the student said to me, Mr. Hall, you don't have to have God in order to get order. I said, okay, what's your argument here? And the student said to me, well, if you put laundry in a dryer for long enough, eventually it would be folded when the cycle was over. And I said, sure, even if that's mathematically possible, you're forgetting that the laundry machine already exists. And it only works one way. It's created, it's completely ordered, and it's not random at all. And the student actually kind of went, oh, darn, like I never thought of that. Another example is, he'll say things like, well, if you put a million monkeys in front of a million typewriters, eventually they'll write you Shakespeare. And this is an idea that, something could happen randomly. Well, for one, that's not really necessarily provable, but also the typewriter already is ordered. It has an alphabet, and that alphabet only functions in a certain way. And the words already exist, and those words are ordered and are not random and are part of language. So there's no way of avoiding it at all. There's no possible way that you could ever prove randomness without using something that's not random, which begs the question, the random result is actually just a calculated result based on formulations that were already ordered in the first place. It's impossible. Last couple things here. Molecules to man evolutionism violates the law of biogenesis. Life does not come from non-life. Exactly. The specific complexity of genetic information in the genome does not increase spontaneously. Therefore, there is no natural process whereby reptiles can turn into birds, land mammals into whales, or chimpanzees into human beings. It's true. All organisms are irreducibly complex. That's another conversation for another day, what that means. As now used by evolutionary scientists, there is virtually no value in radio dating as an objective source of the prehistoric chronology. This is exactly correct. Look into dating processes. Carbon dating is probably more accurate, but even there, after a certain amount of time, it gets unreliable. Many worldwide natural processes indicate an age for the Earth of 10,000 years or less. These include population kinetics, influx of radiocarbon into Earth's atmosphere, absence of meteorites from the geological column, and decay of Earth's magnetic field. Sedimentological research has challenged the principles upon which the geological timescale is based. There is no gradualism in the fossil record, no intermediate types. Conclusion, natural science offers no evidence that would contradict the plain and obvious sense of Genesis 1 to 11, consensus of the Church Fathers, or the magisterial teaching of the Catholic Church on creation and the origins of man and the universe. So, we could go deeper, and perhaps we will. Let me know what you think in the comments, but that's an overview. And Catholics need to stop teaching evolutionary theory as if it's a Catholic thing. At best, there's a very narrow window for a very specific type of discussion on it, but to teach it as fact is just simply not Catholic. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.